The air was thin and cold at 23,000 feet. Captain Thomas Lynch gripped the control column of his P-51D Mustang, his breath forming small clouds inside the cramped cockpit despite the heating system struggling against the altitude. Through the curved plexiglass canopy, he could see them, dark specks materializing from the coastal haze, like a swarm of hornets disturbed from their nest. He counted 12, then 18, then stopped counting. The Japanese fighters came in waves, their silhouettes unmistakable even at distance. The compact aggression of the Mitsubishi A6M0, the brutal angles of the Nakajima K-84 Hayate. His flight consisted of 4 Mustangs, 4 against what appeared to be an entire squadron. Lynch's radio crackled, his wingman's voice tight with tension. "Skipper, we're badly outnumbered." Lynch didn't respond immediately. He adjusted his gun sight, checked his ammunition counters, 1,200 rounds of .50 caliber ready to feed. The mathematics were simple and brutal. In the arithmetic of aerial combat over the Pacific Theater in early 1945, numbers still mattered. Or so the Japanese believed. What they hadn't calculated, what their war colleges and tactical manuals hadn't prepared them for, was that the equation had fundamentally changed. The P-51 Mustang didn't just shift the balance, it redefined what balance meant. "Stay tight," Lynch finally replied. "Let them come to us." This moment, repeated in variations across the shrinking perimeter of the Japanese Empire throughout 1945, represented something more profound than tactical encounters between aircraft. It was the collision of 2 philosophies of war, 2 industrial systems, 2 visions of what air power could achieve. The Japanese pilots diving toward Lynch's formation that January morning carried with them the weight of a warrior tradition stretching back centuries, the discipline of the samurai code adapted to the age of internal combustion. They flew machines that had once commanded the skies from Pearl Harbor to the Dutch East Indies, aircraft that had humiliated Allied air forces and established Japanese dominance over half of the Pacific. They outnumbered the Americans before them by ratios that should have guaranteed victory. But numbers, as the Japanese were learning in the brutal classroom of total war, could lie. The story of how P-51 Mustangs came to rule Japan's final airfields begins not in the Pacific, but in the cold calculation of industrial capacity and the quiet revolution of a single technological breakthrough. When the North American Aviation Company received a British Purchasing Commission contract in 1940 to design a new fighter, nobody envisioned that the resulting aircraft would become the instrument that would break Japanese air power. The early P-51s, powered by Allison engines, were competent but unexceptional, good at low altitude, mediocre above 15,000 feet, adequate for ground attack, but hardly the weapon that would decide the air war. The aircraft that Japanese intelligence evaluated in 1943 seemed interesting but not threatening, certainly not revolutionary. Then came the marriage of American airframe and British engine. When North American engineers mated the Mustang's sleek fuselage to the Rolls-Royce Merlin, license built by Packard in America, they created something that transcended the sum of its parts. The P-51D that emerged in 1944 could fly faster, higher, and farther than virtually any fighter in the sky. Its combat radius exceeded 1,100 miles with external tanks. Its speed topped 440 miles per hour. At altitude, where the air grew thin and Japanese engines gasped for oxygen, the supercharged Merlin sang with power. But specifications alone don't explain what happened in the skies over Japan's final airfields. The numbers in the technical manuals don't capture the psychological transformation that occurred when Japanese pilots, accustomed to air superiority, or at least numerical advantage, found themselves hunted by an enemy that seemed to appear everywhere, that could chase them to any altitude, that possessed inexhaustible ammunition and fuel. Consider what Japanese pilots expected as 1945 began. Despite 3 years of grinding attrition, despite the catastrophic losses at Midway and the Marianas Turkey Shoot, the Imperial Japanese Army and Navy Air Forces still fielded thousands of aircraft. Their newest fighters, the K-84 Hayate, the N-1K2J Shidenkai, the K-100, were excellent machines by any standard, fast and maneuverable with experienced pilots at their controls. Japanese military doctrine emphasized aggressive attack, the concept of ichigeki hisatsu, one strike, certain kill. Their pilots trained in the tradition of Lieutenant Commander Takashige Igusa and Lieutenant Saburo Sakai, men who had honed air combat to a samurai art. When they climbed into their cockpits and took off from airfields at Kyushu, Formosa, or the home islands, they expected that numerical superiority, fighting spirit, and defensive advantage would counterbalance American industrial might. They believed that sacrifice and determination could overcome material disadvantage, that the warrior spirit of Bushido remained relevant in the age of radar and superchargers. The reality they encountered broke against their expectations like waves against stone. Beginning in late 1944, as MacArthur's forces advanced through the Philippines and the Marines prepared to assault Iwo Jima, American P-51 squadrons began appearing with increasing frequency over targets that Japanese pilots had considered secure. The Mustangs came in formations of 20, 40, 60 aircraft, not because they needed such numbers to guarantee victory, but because American productive capacity made such deployments routine. They carried belly tanks that allowed them to escort B-29 bombers all the way to Tokyo and back, or to patrol over Japanese airfields for hours, or to sweep ahead of invasion fleets clearing the sky of defenders. The external tanks themselves became symbols of American abundance, disposable aluminum containers, each one requiring hours of manufacturing labor, jettisoned without thought when combat began. Japanese pilots flying aircraft built in factories that struggled to obtain aluminum and aviation fuel couldn't help but notice the casual waste of resources that their own empire could not match. Lieutenant Yasuhiko Kuroe of the 64 Sentai, a veteran pilot with 17 confirmed victories, recorded his impressions after an encounter with Mustangs over Okinawa in April 1945. He said, "We came at them with the advantage of altitude and numbers, 9 of us against 5 of theirs. We executed the attack perfectly, diving from the sun with maximum speed. I was certain we would destroy at least 3 before they could react. But they saw us somehow, and they didn't run. They turned into our attack, and suddenly we were the ones fighting defensively. Their speed was impossible. Every time I thought I had a shot, the target accelerated away or climbed at an angle our aircraft couldn't match. We lost 2 pilots in the first minute. The rest of us scattered. I landed with bullet holes in my wing and the knowledge that everything I had learned about air combat had become obsolete." This realization that the rules had changed, that experience and courage were no longer sufficient, rippled through Japanese aviation units in the war's final months. Pilots who had survived years of combat, who possessed skills honed across thousands of hours of flight time, found themselves outclassed not by better training or superior tactics, but by an industrial system that could produce aircraft so advanced that numerical advantage became meaningless. The P-51 didn't just outperform Japanese fighters in one dimension, it exceeded them in virtually every measurable category: speed, range, firepower, altitude performance, dive characteristics, roll rate. In each specification, the Mustang held an edge that translated to life or death at 300 miles per hour. But the transformation wasn't merely technological. It was psychological, philosophical, existential. Japanese military culture emphasized spirit over material, will over resources, the intangible qualities of the warrior over the crude calculations of industrial production. This worldview, which had served Japan well in its earlier wars of expansion, collided catastrophically with the reality of American fighting doctrine. The United States didn't ask its pilots to sacrifice themselves. It gave them the best equipment that modern industry could produce, trained them thoroughly in specialized schools, and expected them to return safely from their missions. The P-51 embodied this philosophy in aluminum and steel. Its 6.50 caliber machine guns carried ammunition by the thousands, allowing pilots to engage multiple targets without concern for conservation. Its self-sealing fuel tanks and armored windscreen prioritized pilot survival. Its long range meant pilots didn't face desperate fuel calculations, didn't need to choose between completing their mission and having enough gasoline to return home. Consider the symbolic weight of those external fuel tanks again, not as mere technical devices, but as representations of competing ideologies. Each Mustang carried 2 teardrop-shaped tanks under its wings, 75 or 110 gallons each, fabricated from stamped aluminum, pressurized and sealed, then mounted on simple release mechanisms. When combat began, pilots toggled a switch and the tanks fell away, tumbling toward Earth. In the course of the Pacific Air Campaign, American forces jettisoned tens of thousands of these tanks, each one representing more aluminum than many Japanese aircraft factories received in a month. To Japanese pilots watching these disposable containers fall past their cockpits, the message was unmistakable. America possessed resources so vast that it could afford to throw away what Japan desperately hoarded. The actual combat experience reinforced this material disparity with brutal consistency. When P-51s began flying escort missions for B-29 raids on the Japanese home islands in the spring of 1945, Japanese defensive interceptors faced an impossible dilemma. To attack the bombers, they had to break through the Mustang's screen, but the Mustangs were faster, could outclimb them, and had numerical superiority. If Japanese fighters focused on the escorts, the bombers proceeded unmolested to their targets. If they ignored the escorts and went for the bombers, the Mustangs dove on them from above with overwhelming firepower. Japanese ace warrant officer Takashi Oshibuchi described the experience. It was like being hunted by wolves. They worked in pairs, always covering each other. If you committed to attacking one, his wingman was already positioning for a shot at you. If you tried to escape, they followed you down, and their dive speed exceeded ours. If you climbed, they climbed faster. There was no escape, no tactical solution. We could only hope for a lucky shot or that their ammunition would run out. It never did. The numbers tell the story with cold precision. In January 1945, Japanese air forces in the home islands and surrounding territories could field approximately 3,000 combat-capable aircraft. By August, that number had dwindled to fewer than 1,000 operational machines, despite frantic production efforts that saw factories dispersed into caves and school buildings converted to assembly shops. The attrition wasn't primarily due to bombing of factories or fuel shortages, though both played roles. The aircraft were being destroyed in the air, shot down by fighters they couldn't evade or outfight. American records from the 21st Fighter Group operating P-51s from Iwo Jima beginning in March 1945 document the disparity. In 5 months of operations, the group destroyed 333 Japanese aircraft in air combat, while losing 18 Mustangs to enemy fighters, an exchange ratio of better than 18-1. These weren't cherry-picked statistics from exceptional engagements. They represented the systematic, consistent results of technical superiority applied across hundreds of missions. On April 7, 1945, when Japan launched Operation Tengo, sending the battleship Yamato on a one-way mission to Okinawa, accompanied by cruisers and destroyers, American commanders deployed both carrier aircraft and long-range P-51s from recently captured bases to ensure the task force never reached its destination. The Mustangs arrived over the Japanese fleet just as torpedo bombers from Task Force 58 were beginning their attack runs. Japanese combat air patrol fighters, already outnumbered and low on fuel from intercepting earlier American strikes, found themselves engaged by fresh P-51s that had flown 400 miles from Okinawa specifically to prevent any Japanese aircraft from interfering with the strike on Yamato. The result was predictable. The American torpedo and bomb attacks proceeded without effective opposition. The battleship capsized and exploded. The Mustangs returned to base, most with ammunition remaining. The psychological impact on surviving Japanese pilots cannot be quantified in statistics, but it emerges clearly from personal accounts and post-war interviews. Flight Petty Officer Nao Shikano, who flew as a wingman during defensive operations over Kyushu in June 1945, recalled, "We knew when we saw them, the silver aircraft with their distinctive shape, that this would probably be our last mission. Not because we lacked courage or skill, but because they had all the advantages: speed, altitude, range, firepower, numbers, and most crushing of all, they had fuel. We took off knowing we had perhaps 40 minutes of combat endurance. They could stay over our airfields for hours. They could escort bombers to Tokyo and back. They could hunt us at our alternate landing strips. The war had become impossible, but we were ordered to fly anyway, and so we did, knowing each takeoff might be the last." This sense of hopelessness, of fighting an enemy that possessed unlimited resources, permeated Japanese aviation in 1945. It manifested in the increasing prevalence of special attack tactics, kamikaze missions where pilots deliberately crashed bomb-laden aircraft into American ships. While Japanese propaganda portrayed these attacks as expressions of martial spirit and devotion to the emperor, the reality was more complex and more tragic. The special attack units increasingly consisted of minimally trained pilots flying obsolete aircraft on one-way missions, not because this represented the highest form of warrior culture, but because conventional air combat had become suicidal without achieving military purpose. A pilot with 50 hours of flight time in a bomb-laden Zero had virtually no chance of shooting down a P-51 Mustang flown by an American pilot with 300 hours of training. But he might, if he evaded the combat air patrol and anti-aircraft fire, crash his aircraft into a ship and achieve something tactically significant. The kamikaze phenomenon, often misunderstood as an expression of fanatical devotion, was in reality an admission of technological and industrial defeat. The P-51 pilots themselves were not immune to the moral and psychological weight of this superiority. They were young men, many barely out of their teens, who found themselves executing missions where the outcome was essentially predetermined. Lieutenant Robert Lee, flying with the 15th Fighter Group out of Iwo Jima, described a mission over Kobe in July 1945. "We were escorting B-29s, about 60 Mustangs covering 40 bombers. Japanese fighters came up, looked like maybe 30 or 40 of them, a mix of types, nothing uniform. They were brave, I'll give them that. They came right at us despite the odds. But it wasn't even a fair fight. We had altitude, speed, numbers, fuel, ammunition. Within 10 minutes, half their formation was falling out of the sky. The rest scattered. We didn't lose a single aircraft. As we circled over the target watching the bombs fall, I felt sick. Not from fear or adrenaline, but from the waste of it all. Those Japanese pilots were dying for nothing, defending targets they couldn't possibly protect, fighting battles they'd already lost. And we were the instruments of that futility. This was the true transformation that occurred in the skies over Japan's final airfields. Not just a shift in tactical advantage, but a fundamental alteration in the nature of aerial warfare. The Japanese had entered the war with a philosophy that emphasized individual skill, martial spirit, and tactical brilliance. They believed that superior fighting spirit could overcome material disadvantage, that their warrior tradition represented an intangible advantage that industrial capacity couldn't match. The P-51 Mustang and the system that produced it demonstrated the falseness of this belief with relentless mechanical precision. Superior aircraft, abundant fuel and ammunition, comprehensive training, numerical advantage, and tactical flexibility combined to create a form of air power that rendered traditional virtues of courage and skill almost irrelevant. The symbolic object that best captures this transformation is neither weapon nor sound, but something more mundane and more damning: the maintenance log. Every P-51 Mustang flew with a detailed maintenance record, documenting every hour of flight time, every inspection, every part replacement. Ground crews followed rigorous schedules, replacing components based on projected service life rather than waiting for failures. If an engine approached its rated operational hours, mechanics swapped it for a fresh unit, and the removed engine might be completely refurbished and installed in another aircraft. The spare parts pipeline flowed from American factories across the Pacific with such regularity that squadron commanders didn't consider parts availability when planning missions. They assumed, correctly, that whatever they needed would be available. Japanese maintenance crews, by contrast, operated in conditions of perpetual scarcity. Spare parts arrived sporadically, if at all. Engines ran hundreds of hours beyond rated life because replacements didn't exist. Mechanics cannibalized crashed aircraft for components, fabricated repair parts by hand, improvised solutions that would have horrified American inspectors. A Japanese fighter might be technically operational while flying with mismatched tires, a patched fuel tank, ammunition belts hand-loaded with whatever caliber rounds were available, and an engine that consumed oil and barely produced rated power. The maintenance logs, had they been preserved with the same rigor as American records, would have documented not regular service intervals, but rather desperate expedients and steadily degrading capability. This disparity in maintenance and logistics ultimately mattered more than the specifications of individual aircraft. A Ki-84 Hayat, fresh from the factory, could match a P-51 in certain performance parameters. But after 50 hours of combat operations, the Mustang would still perform to specification, while the Hayat would be measurably slower, less reliable, with guns that jammed more frequently, and an engine that might fail without warning. Multiply this across thousands of aircraft and millions of flight hours, and the cumulative effect was a Japanese Air Force that degraded steadily even as it received new aircraft, while American capabilities remained consistent or improved. By the summer of 1945, the transformation was complete. P-51 Mustangs operated over Japan's airspace with near impunity, conducting sweeps that destroyed aircraft on the ground, strafed trains and vehicles, escorted bombers to any target in the home island. Japanese fighters rose to meet them in decreasing numbers and with diminishing effectiveness. The final major air battles of the Pacific War occurred over Tokyo in August 1945, just days before the atomic bombs fell. American records document these encounters with clinical precision. On August 13th, Approximately 100 Japanese fighters attempted to intercept a force of B-29s escorted by P-51s. The engagement lasted less than 20 minutes. American pilots claimed 31 Japanese aircraft destroyed. 2 P-51s were damaged. None were lost. 3 days later, after Hiroshima and Nagasaki lay in ruins, the Emperor's surrender broadcast ended the war. In the immediate post-war period, when occupation forces reached Japanese airfields and interviewed surviving pilots, a consistent theme emerged from their accounts. They spoke not primarily of fear or hatred, but of exhaustion and futility. They had fought against an enemy that seemed to possess infinite resources, that could replace every loss, that approached warfare as an industrial process rather than a martial contest. The P-51 Mustang, in their recollections, symbolized this unbridgeable gap, an aircraft that represented not just superior engineering, but an entire system of resource extraction, industrial production, logistics, and training that Japan could never match. The epilogue of this story extends beyond the immediate narrative of aerial combat. The P-51 Mustang's dominance over Japanese airspace in 1945 demonstrated a truth about modern warfare that has remained relevant into the 21st century. In conflicts between industrialized nations, material capacity ultimately determines outcomes more decisively than courage, tradition, or tactical skill. The Japanese pilots who flew against Mustangs in the war's final months possessed all the traditional martial virtues: bravery, discipline, skill, willingness to sacrifice. These qualities, which might have decided wars in earlier eras, proved insufficient against an enemy that could simply produce more and better equipment, train more pilots, and sustain operations indefinitely. The 6,000 words of this narrative could extend to 60,000 and still not capture every engagement, every individual story, every technical detail of how P-51s came to rule Japan's final airfields. But the essential truth remains clear and consistent across all those untold stories. When Captain Lynch faced overwhelming numbers over Formosa in January 1945, when Lieutenant Kuroe watched his advantages evaporate in seconds over Okinawa, when Warrant Officer Oshibuchi described being hunted by wolves, all these moments were variations of a single larger reality. The P-51 Mustang was not just a superior fighter aircraft, it was the physical manifestation of a way of warfare that prioritized industrial capacity and technological advantage over human factors. It represented the culmination of democracy's ability to mobilize resources, to harness production capacity, to treat human life as precious enough to protect with the best available equipment. The Japanese pilots who survived the war, who returned to devastated cities and began the long process of rebuilding, carried with them the memory of silver aircraft appearing in endless numbers, of dogfights that became hopeless chases, of comrades falling one by one against an enemy that never seemed to tire or run out of ammunition. For them, the P-51 Mustang remained a symbol not just of defeat, but of the moment when traditional notions of warfare collapsed before the realities of industrial modernity. They had expected that their training, their tradition, their willingness to sacrifice would be sufficient. They had believed that outnumbering the enemy guaranteed advantage. They learned, in the most brutal classroom imaginable, that these expectations belonged to a world that no longer existed. And in the end, that transformation, from expectation to reality, from confidence to despair, from superiority to defeat, defines the true story of how outnumbered Mustangs came to rule Japan's final airfields. It wasn't merely about aircraft specifications or kill ratios. It was about the collision of two philosophies of war, two industrial systems, two visions of what human conflict would mean in the modern age. The Mustang pilots returned home after the war to ticker-tape parades and grateful nations. The Japanese pilots who survived returned to occupation and reconstruction, carrying with them the knowledge that they had fought honorably in a war that honor alone could not win. The Mustang itself, that elegant synthesis of American ingenuity and British engineering, became a museum piece and a beloved warbird, preserved and celebrated as the fighter that helped win the air war. But its true legacy lies not in the aircraft themselves, now carefully maintained by civilian enthusiasts, but in what those silver machines represented during those final months over Japan. The inexorable power of industrial democracy when fully mobilized, the reality that freedom and abundance could be forged into weapons that ideology and sacrifice could not defeat. That lesson, learned at terrible cost in the skies over a dying empire, remains etched in history as clearly as the contrails those Mustangs left across the Pacific sky.